All right, everybody, welcome back. I hope casting on went well for you, and I hope you've spent some time practicing it if it's a new skill for you. So at this point, we have our 30 stitches on our needle, and your work might look similar to this. So I have my stitches on my needle here, and I have a lot of extra yarn. So again, with the long tail cast on, we want to have more yarn than we need rather than not enough, because at the end of casting on, if you run out of yarn, then unfortunately you have to start over and give yourself more yarn. So yours hopefully looks something like this, where we have extra yarn here. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to trim that extra yarn until about, like, I don't know, 6 or 8 inches. That'll give us a nice long end that we're going to weave in later. So for now, we're just gonna trim it, and we're just gonna leave it there for a while, and later at the end of our scarf, when we're all finished, I'll show you what to do with that to finish. So you should be here, you should have 30 stitches on your needle. You'll see we have this short tail, and then we also have the yarn that's connected to our skein, or our knitting yarn. So we've learned how to cast on. Now we're going to learn how to knit your first row. So we'll do a couple of rows together. The first row, I'm gonna just show you kind of close up. I have a little poem or riddle that I use. I have taught people from kindergartners all the way up through high school students to senior citizens. So the riddle seems to work for almost everybody that I've taught, so I'm gonna show it to you today. So your yarn is gonna be coming off of your skein as you're knitting. This is your working yarn, okay? Your knitting yarn. So I'm just going to kind of push it to the side so it doesn't disrupt the view of our stitches. So here we are up close with our 30 stitches on our needle. Because I'm using a circular needle, you're just pretending as if these are two separate needles. So you are always knitting from your left needle to your right needle. So all of our stitches right now are on our left needle, and our right needle is empty and ready for us to move the stitches from left to right. So you're always going to be moving the stitches from your left to your right, okay? So to get started, I'm pushing these stitches close to the end of my needle, but not so close where you'll worry about them slipping off, okay? So for our very first stitch, what I want to make sure that you don't do is don't start knitting with that tail that we trimmed. You want to make sure that the yarn you're knitting with is the one that's attached to your skein. And the reason I say that is because I, like many other knitters, have made that mistake a lot of times. And then you have to go back and fix it. So here's my knitting yarn. I can tell I'm verifying that it's attached to my skein. So to knit, here's the little riddle. You go in through the front door, around the back, peek through the window, and off jumps Jack. So I'm going to explain that as we go. So your very first step, you go into the stitch so that your needles are crossed like an X. You'll notice that my right hand needle is underneath my left hand needle, and I went into the stitch from back or front to back. Okay. Now I'm wrapping my yarn around the tip of my right hand needle. Notice I wrapped it around from back to front. Then with my right hand needle, I'm moving that tip of the needle through this little window that is created by that old stitch. Okay, so I'm pulling it towards me, and then this is the important part. Off jumps Jack. That stitch has to officially jump off your left needle and on to your right needle. So I go in to the stitch like so. I'm wrapping my yarn around the back. I'm taking the tip of my right hand needle and I'm bringing it toward me through that little window created by the stitch. And then that stitch hops off the left needle and onto the right needle. So I've now knit 3 stitches. I'm going to do that all the way across my row. So again, I make an X with my needles. The right needle is under the left needle. Wrapping the yarn around the right needle And then I take this needle tip and I'm pulling it towards me. I'm pulling it towards me, and you can see how that tip is popping through that little window created by the stitch. And off jumps Jack. In through the front door, around the back, peek through the window, and off jumps Jack. So you want to do that all the way across the row. Okay, I'll just try to slow it down a little bit here again, making an X with my needle tips, wrapping the yarn around the back. That needle is peeking through, and the old stitch is hopping off. One thing that's important when you're knitting is don't let your stitches get so close to the tips of your needles so that you worry about them sliding off. Like this might be too close for a beginner, because any movement in that stitch will cause it to fall off. Another thing that's really important is new knitters often knit really tight. So when they're wrapping the yarn around, they're cranking it really hard and pulling it really tight. You don't want to do that because it makes your stitches really tight and it makes the next row very difficult to knit. Just getting some more yarn there. So when you are wrapping your yarn, it's just like casting on. You want to pull it snug, but not too tight. So when you're wrapping the yarn around, you're snug, but not too tight. Another thing that new knitters often do as well is when they're knitting the stitch and when it hops off, they pull their needles like this. So all you're doing when you do that is you've created a bigger gap between those stitches. So you don't want to pull your needle tips away from each other. You want to keep them relatively close so that it's comfortable, but also that you're not pulling them away from each other. Just some kind of little techniques for you. I've taught a lot of people how to knit, and these are just common mistakes I've seen over the years. So again, you want to wrap your yarn. You want to be snug but not too tight. Your stitches should move along your needle. If you have to pull really hard to get them to move, it means that your stitches are a little too tight. So this is what's called tension, and as you're learning how to knit, you might be knitting tightly, you might be knitting loosely, and that's totally normal and totally fine. As you get more comfortable with your project and with knitting, you're going to find what works for you and you're going to find what's comfortable. So I'm getting to the end of my very first row. And if you're still struggling with the knit stitch, just go back and start the video over. It might take you a couple of times before you're feeling comfortable with it, and that's okay. That's the beauty of this course, is that you can work at your own pace. So I'm at my last stitch. Sometimes the last stitch can feel, because there's nothing else holding it to the needle, so it feels like it might slip a little bit more. So just kind of, sometimes I even kind of hold that stitch with my finger just to kind of keep it in place. Okay, so you're just knitting it just like you do all of the other stitches, and wrapping around the back, your needle peeks through and off jumps Jack. And there you have just knit your very first row. So your work should look a little something like this. So to start your next row, what you do is your stitches go back into your left hand. So again, we're always knitting from our left needle to our right needle. Your stitches go back into your left hand. Your empty needle is now in your right hand, and you do it all over again, and you just knit all the way across. When you finish a row, you're going to find after you knit your last stitch that we knit our last stitch, and now all of the stitches are on the needle in my right hand, and my left needle is empty. So to start the next row, all I do, I'm going to drop my left needle, switch this to my left hand, grab that empty needle with my right hand, and I am ready to knit my next row. So go ahead and knit a couple of rows and just get comfortable with it. If you need to watch the video again, please do so. If there's something that I didn't cover or you need more help with something, please reach out to me. I'm happy to provide additional videos to help you get unstuck. When you are learning how to knit, it is really important every couple rows to count your stitches. You should always have 30 stitches. In the next video, I'm going to talk a little bit about some common mistakes. It's very normal when you're first learning how to knit to increase stitches or to drop stitches. So I'm going to show you how to avoid those common mistakes, or if you've made that mistake, I'm going to show you how to fix it. So again, congratulations, you learned how to cast on. You've knit your first row. Go ahead and give it a try and knit a few more rows, and I'm going to be back here to help with some of those troubleshooting things that you might run into as you're getting started. See you there.